This video is inverse sine, part 2, where we focus on problems with special angles or values. And this is still section 6.5. Okay, so let's look at this example. This asks us to find the inverse sine of 1/2 or the arc sine of 1/2. So basically you're trying to think of what angle has a sine that is equal to 1/2. And it does have to fall in the range of negative pi over 2 to positive pi over 2. Okay. So if you're thinking about the graph, then you can come up with, there's a point at 1/2 and pi over 6. All right, and the answer would be pi over 6. All right, there can only be one answer because inverse sine, arc sine, is a function. So for any one input, there can only be one output. Now, if you're asked to find the inverse sine of negative 1/2, then you're looking for the angle whose sine is equal to negative 1/2. All right. So if you go back and you look on the graph, this time you would look to the left. You're inputting negative 1/2, and there's a point at negative pi over 6. All right, these graphs are not really drawn to scale, but they give you the idea. So the inverse sine of negative 1/2 or the arc sine of negative 1/2 is equal to negative pi over 6. Okay, so this was asking for what angle has a sine value that's equal to negative 1/2 and falls in the range between negative pi over 2 to positive pi over 2. All right, there can only be one answer. All right, now this is often a little tricky. For example, you cannot say that the inverse sine of negative 1/2 is equal to 330 degrees, or, sticking with radians, 11 pi over 6. All right, you can't say two different answers. Okay, we said that the inverse sine of negative 1/2 in radians is negative pi over 6. Okay, in degrees, that would be negative 30 degrees. Okay, so you could work it in degrees or radians. These are basically the same angle, though. You can't say this because that would give you two different outputs for the same input. It would give you two ordered pairs with the same y-coordinate. All right. Now, this is a little tricky because when we were working problems on the unit circle, a lot of times we go from 0 to 360 degrees or from 0 to 3 pi. And when we're talking about an angle here in the fourth quadrant, whose y-coordinate is negative 1/2, we often refer to that angle as 330 degrees or 11 pi over 6. Okay, but if you are working with the inverse sine function, okay, or remember it could be written with arc sine, then you are limited. Okay, if you are interested in the inverse sine of negative 1/2, you're going to have to refer to this angle as a negative angle and think of the rotation as going that way. And in degrees, you'll say negative 30 degrees, or in radians, you would say negative pi over 6. Okay, so to be super clear, let's look at the unit circle. Okay, if you're doing special angles and special values, everything is right on the unit circle. Okay, if you're dealing in radians for inverse sine, the range or all the answers will be between negative pi over 2 and positive pi over 2. That restricts you to quadrants 1 and 4. You will not use these quadrants at all. Okay, and all your answers will be between negative pi over 2 and positive pi over 2. All right, now these are the special values. So there's only 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 places with special values. So the answers that you might possibly give to an inverse sine question with a special value could be 0, pi over 6, pi over 4, pi over 3, pi over 2, or negative pi over 6, negative pi over 4, negative pi over 3, or negative pi over 2. Okay, if you're trying to find the inverse sine of a positive number, it'll be one of the ones in the first quadrant. If you're trying to find the inverse sine of a negative number, it'll be one of these ones in the fourth quadrant, and it'll be a negative answer. All right. Now, if you're doing inverse sine, but you're working with degrees, then your range is going to be from negative 90 to positive 90 degrees. Okay, and then on the unit circle, again, it's only going to be using quadrants 1 or 4. You're not going to use 2 or 3 when you're doing inverse sine. Okay, and all your answers will be between negative 90 degrees and positive 90 degrees. And the other special angles would be 0 degrees, 30 degrees, 45 degrees, 60 degrees, or negative 30 degrees, negative 45 degrees, negative 60 degrees. All right? So the answer choices are very limited for inverse sine with special angles and values. Okay, so let's just try a few problems where they ask you to find the exact values. Okay. So this one says the inverse sine of root 3 over 2. All right. Let's work it first in radians. Then we'll come back and pretend the directions were find the answer in degrees. Okay, so you're basically looking for the angle whose sine value is the square root of 3 divided by 2. Okay, so think about the unit circle. It has to be one of these ones that I've written in purple. That's it. Those are the only choices. All right. So where is the sine equal to the square root of 3 over 2? Up near the very top of the circle, not the very top, but almost to the top, at pi over 3. All right. That point there, the y coordinate is the square root of 3 over 2. All right, so the answer to this in radians would be pi over 3. All right. Okay, let's say you're supposed to find the arc sine of negative 1. Okay, so like I said, we'll do this in radians. What angle in radians has a sine value equal to negative 1? All right. That will put us down at the very bottom of the circle. Down here, that's where a point is whose y coordinate is negative 1. So the answer is going to be negative pi over 2. All right, for sine, if you're doing an arc sine value of a negative, you'll have a negative angle. Okay, arc sine of negative root 2 over 2. All right, so like I just said, that's a negative number. The answer is going to be something negative. Okay, where does the sine have a value of negative root 2 over 2? That is going to be right in the middle of quadrant 4. All right, that's where the y coordinate is negative root 2 over 2. So the answer to this one is negative pi over 4. Okay, the inverse sine of 0, where is the sine equal to 0? All right, that would be right here. This point that's on the x-axis has a y coordinate equal to 0. So in radians, that angle is 0. If we go back and work these in degrees, just from the top, the inverse sine of the square root of 3 over 2, okay, that will be 60 degrees. All right, negative pi over 2, that's where the sine is equal to -1. In radians, it'll be -90 degrees. All right. Negative pi over 4. That was the one that was right in the middle of quadrant 4. So in degrees, that's going to be -45 degrees. All right. And the one where we were doing the inverse sine of 0, 0 radians, that's the same thing as 0 degrees.